From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The House Ethics Committee releases its report in the investigation of alleged misconduct by former Congressman Matt Gaetz, finding, quote, substantial evidence, unquote, of drug use, prostitution, and statutory rape. Meantime, Donald Trump wades into the debate over daylight savings time. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial board member Mene Ukwe-Barua. About a month after Matt Gaetz formally withdrew from his nomination as Donald Trump's next Attorney General of the United States, the House Ethics Committee has released its long-running investigation into alleged misconduct by the former congressman. And Kim, this 37-page report from the Ethics Committee is a pretty ugly document. It goes through allegations that Gaetz and one of his associates would find women on this sugar dating website and initiate contact with them, hold parties with them where there was drug use and then payments for sexual conduct, sexual activity. It says that Mr. Gaetz did not appear to have negotiated specific payment amounts, but then goes on to say the women had a general expectation that they would typically receive some amount of money after each sexual encounter. Committee obtained the text messages with lines like, Matt also mentioned he is going to be a bit generous, unquote, before one of these liaisons. Kim, what do you make of this report and the credibility of these allegations?
So the allegations come down to three buckets as I read the report. One is that he regularly paid for sex. That particular allegation includes the detail that supposedly in one instance with a 17-year-old, and the committee went out of its way to note that under Florida law, this would amount to statutory rape, which makes it a crime for someone over a certain age to have sexual intercourse with someone who is 16 or 17 years old. The report notes that under that law, it is no defense to say that you do not know how old the person was. By the way, we should note that Mr. Gaetz has denied any criminal wrongdoing as part of this. And on a Twitter post today, he actually went out of his way to say that he'd never had sexual relationships with anyone under the age of 18. So he's not just disputing the characterization of some of these allegations, but he's actually disputing some of the facts. For what that is worth, that is his defense, and he has not backed down on that. That's one bucket. Another bucket is that he obtained or used impermissible gifts under House rules, including a trip and lodging to the Bahamas. And finally, that he used or possessed certain illicit drugs, including cocaine and ecstasy. It is a very ugly report. It certainly casts a new light on why Mr. Gaetz presumably resigned from Congress so abruptly upon being named Trump's pick for Attorney General. Obviously, that did not last long. And again, we need to be clear that he is continuing to dispute this. He actually filed a lawsuit in federal court on Monday morning to try to stop the release of the report. He's also suing for defamation. So he continues to dispute this. But I would note that these were 10 members of the Ethics Committee, 5 from each party. They worked on this probe for about 3 years. And while there were some disputes over whether or not to publicly release it, given that he has left Congress, there doesn't look to be much of a dispute among those committee members about the contents of the report.
Here's a bit more of what Matt Gaetz said on Twitter. This is from last week. He said, in my single days, I often sent funds to women I dated, even some I never dated, but who asked. I dated several of these women for years. I never had sexual contact with someone under 18. Any claim that I have would be destroyed in court, which is why no such claim was ever made in court. He added that it's embarrassing, though not criminal, that I probably partied, womanized, drank, and smoked more than I should have earlier in life. I live a different life now. He also suggested that the Department of Justice had investigated him and he was not charged with anything, which in his characterization means that he was fully exonerated. a couple things that I would add to what Kim said. One is that with respect to this 17-year-old, this is an allegation that he had sex with a minor at a house party in 2017. The committee says that this allegation was corroborated by multiple individuals, including the woman herself, who testified that that evening she was given $400 in cash from Representative Gaetz, which she understood to be payment for sex. The report also has this line: she did not inform Representative Gaetz that she was under 18 at the time, nor did he ask. The committee also says that it has evidence that Gaetz did not know her age until at least a month after that encounter. However, on the point about exoneration, Monet, I also think that this is notable from the committee, because the committee is saying that in its view, there were state laws that were clearly breached here, but this conduct may not have fallen precisely under the federal statute against sex trafficking. And then this again is from the committee report. It says, although Representative Gaetz did cause the transportation of women across state lines for purposes of commercial sex, the committee did not find evidence that any of those women were under 18 at the time of travel, nor did the committee find sufficient evidence to conclude that the commercial sex acts were induced by force, fraud, or coercion. And so that might help explain why the federal investigation by the Justice Department did not bring any charges against Representative Gaetz. At least that's the committee's apparent view of the matter.
Right. I think that the big question for a lot of the public is going to be why the Justice Department decided not to move forward with its own investigation. That, of course, is going to be something that we'll hear most likely from Matt Gaetz repeatedly in the aftermath of the release of this report, because he wants to claim that all of the evidence being presented by the House committee is politicized, and that the people with the responsibility for determining whether any crime was committed had already looked into it and decided that it wasn't worth pursuing. And I do think that there is substantive debate regarding the specifics of that federal statute. As you mentioned, it's possible that he might not have fallen afoul of that specific law, and therefore it made sense for the Justice Department to hesitate. But I think in terms of his culpability for the action, people will say in the court of public opinion, certainly, that he's guilty not only of statutory rape, most likely as we understand it by the evidence that he disputes, but also that it was him and his associates who invited these women to come to these parties. And so that does, I think, reach what is commonly understood to be the standard of trafficking generally, even if it's not necessarily the letter of the federal law that he would be held accountable to. And I do think in terms of his explanation for having dated lots of women and sometimes compensated them, that doesn't really mesh with the details as the report presented them either, in the sense that they weren't describing these as relationships over some longer period of time where he was buying trips or giving gifts or anything of that kind. What was presented here was using a service online where these women were invited to specific events, and then cash was exchanged afterward, and not a continuing relationship. And so I think that he's trying to blur the lines on some of the evidence that was presented in the report. But if the information being presented is accurate, it does seem as if he's culpable for something much more serious than the types of casual dating relationships he's describing.
Hang tight. We'll be right back in a moment. Welcome back. Kim, what's your view of the decision by the Ethics Committee to release this report? There's been weeks of speculation about that. Matt Gaetz, shortly after Trump said that he was going to be appointed, nominated for Attorney General, resigned from Congress. That was viewed by many people as an attempt to forestall the release of this report. And that if a member of Congress resigns, then the Ethics Committee closes that matter quietly. And there is some debate about this in the report. So the report itself says that the committee released it, does not do so lightly. The mysterious workings of the Ethics Committee, it says that a majority of the members voted to release these findings to the public, but it doesn't say what the majority is. It doesn't give the vote count. It doesn't give the names of the members on each side. And this is what is taken up substantially by this one-page dissenting statement at the end of the report, as written by Republican Michael Gaetz. 2 points about this. First, it says, while we do not challenge the committee's findings, which I think is important, we take great exception that the majority deviated from the committee's well-established standards, voted to release a report on an individual no longer under the committee's jurisdiction, goes on to argue that that's a dangerous departure with potentially catastrophic consequences. And Kim, I guess what's your take on that? Because on one hand, if a member of Congress resigns, you can understand why the Ethics Committee would have an interest in just closing down that inquiry without a public statement. On the other hand, this was a situation where Gaetz resigned, it seems, in order specifically to avoid accountability for this while trying to get a promotion, though he's, of course, since dropped his bid for AG.
Look, I do agree with one aspect of this dissent, which was written by Michael Gaetz, who's a former federal prosecutor and was very concerned about the precedent. And that's my concern too, which is just that I think it's a very sound policy that the House, if somebody withdraws or resigns from Congress, the argument has always been that they no longer have jurisdiction over that anymore, that if there are crimes that are being pursued, they should be pursued by law enforcement, that the House's interest in this, which is the ethical, upstanding nature of its own members, is at an end because that member is gone. And why this concerns me is that we've had so much precedent breaking in Washington in recent years. And you do not need a lot of imagination to imagine this being used as a precedent in future by either party to seek to embarrass one side or the other. And that gets to, as well, the Ethics Committee is one of the rare committees in the House and in the Senate that has a certain amount of bipartisanship, collegiality, and respect by other members. Part of that is because it's a let's not throw stones at glass houses. That committee is very careful not to become weaponized. It's also set up and structured in such a way to make it difficult for that to happen. But you would not like to see that end. We already have too much partisanship in Washington. So I do see that. On the other hand, this is not the first time the committee has released a record over congresspeople who have resigned. It did it back in 2006. Following some very serious allegations. And so there is some precedent for it. It's very rare, and maybe they can try to present this time as rare. And as you note, this wasn't a congressperson leaving to go off and become a car dealer or a dentist again in regular life. They were seeking higher office. Now, the one thing that I think complicates that is Gaetz has been withdrawn from that position. So, on the whole, I think this was a complex decision. What we do know, though, is that there was a majority who voted for it. We don't know how everyone voted, but that's the way that committee works, which means that there had to have been at least one Republican who voted along to make it public.
This does, I think, also vindicate the skepticism of Republican senators after Matt Gaetz was nominated for AG. Some of them went on the record. You can only imagine that more of them were expressing that skepticism privately, maybe to the Trump camp, maybe to each other. But this is the Senate's advise and consent role, Monet. And one prospect that we could have had Gaetz not dropped his bid for the AG's post would be to get this kind of report, days before some sort of televised Senate confirmation hearings where Matt Gaetz is going to be taking questions from the Senate. Maybe some of these women who testified before the Ethics Committee would be called before the TV cameras to tell their sides of these stories. And the fact that it became clear so early and so obviously that Matt Gaetz was going to have trouble getting over this confirmation hurdle and decided to withdraw from that process, it seems to me has saved not only the country some trouble and a very problematic nominee, but also saved President Trump some political trouble. And so that is the kind of awkward position that some of these Republican senators find themselves in, is that sometimes the best service to the president, the incoming president-elect of their own party, might be saying no to some of these personnel decisions if they're not in the country's interest and not in the president-elect's interest.
Absolutely. I think that if Gaetz's nomination had proceeded to the point of hearings, it would have been an absolute disaster for him, as this information was aired publicly on television for the entire nation to see. It would have been a disaster for the Trump administration. having to defend this and having to defend their decision to appoint this person who people have known for years had these allegations attached to him. And it would have been a disaster for the congressional Republicans who had to make a decision on his nomination. I think that there was no chance that this information wasn't going to get out in some form. Certainly the fact that the ethics committee voted to release the report despite his withdrawing means that they would have done it if he had continued to be nominated. And even in this odd event that they hadn't, the information would have got out. You saw a lot of Republican senators demanding to see the contents of the report, and it certainly would have been leaked. I do think that the decision of Matt Gaetz to withdraw was probably prompted only because a lot of Republican senators held firm and told him in private meetings, there's not a chance based on what we know about your record that I'm going to vote for you. And so I think that they did a great service to the country, whoever those senators were, who said that there was no chance that they would vote to confirm him. He saw the writing on the wall, decided to withdraw. President Trump himself probably also saw that writing on the wall and decided not to make a big push for it, not to threaten Republican senators with primaries if they didn't go along with voting for Gaetz. And they dodged what would have been a really, really chaotic event by not having him move forward.